This week's Parsha, Devarim, talks about wars. It's a complex issue, and there are some which are divinely ordained, some which are for self-defense. Ultimately, this world is meant to be a garden of God, a beautiful place, peaceful place for everyone. And even Isaiah talks about, Yeshaya talks about what Mashiach, the Messiah, shall judge between the nations and reprove many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift the sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war anymore. First, let's talk about the biblically ordained wars. Number one was the war with Canaan, the land of Canaan. This was when we were going to possess the land. And at that time, God said that the Jewish people will go in and they will conquer. But first, you have to offer peace. If the people in the city are willing to live by the 7 Noahide laws, a just judicial system, and high moral values, they're welcome to stay and participate. If not, they have to be eliminated because the evil corruption that existed in that community and that society needed to be completely eradicated. Again, a biblical command. The second biblical command is against the nation of Amalek. Amalek was that nation which had the chutzpah, the audacity to attack the Jewish people fresh out of Egypt. You know, here was Egypt, the mega power of the world at the time, and God had decimated them and brought out his people from Egypt, and the rest of the world was mortified about God and his people. And here comes this nation of Amalek that had the audacity to attack. And that audacity, God decreed, has to be destroyed completely. Now, it's not a valid commandment at this time in our lifetime because no one who knows who the nation of Amalek is anymore. It's kind of dissipated. But those were biblical wars commanded by God. So let's look at the difference between Milchamos Mitzvah and Milchamos Reshus. Milchamos Mitzvah is a mandatory war, which is directive, the ones we just talked about, directives that are commanded by God. The Milchamos Reshus, the discretionary wars, are the ones that a king can engage in order to create security for the people or potentially to expand the borders. But the Milchamos Reshus, these have to be validated by the Sanhedrin, the high court. The high court would meet in the temple, and it was a court of 70 elders. These are the sages of Israel. And to do any Milchamos Reshus, the discretionary wars, that has to have the approval of the Sanhedrin, the high court. So this is not a matter that's taken lightly. What about Sabbath and weaponry? We don't carry on the Sabbath. We don't carry in the public domain on Sabbath. But then the question becomes, is a weapon an ornament like a jewelry, or is it something of discredit? And so there's two sides. You know, if it's like a uniform, a person and that's a uniform person who wears a weapon, then that in a sense is ornamental. It's like jewelry, and it's mekavedik. It honors him. You know, it shows it's something that he is proud of his status and his position, his involvement. Or the other side would be, because the idea of war and killing is a negative thing, is that therefore it's not an ornament, it's not honoring him, and in which case then it wouldn't be considered an ornament of jewelry, and he shouldn't be worn on Sabbath. So this is an interesting discussion amongst the sages of weaponry and the Sabbath. Is it something which he wears and it honors him, or the opposite? Interesting question. Another interesting insight from the Torah regarding war, especially during wartime, but even not during wartime, the camp must be holy. The idea is that God dwells amongst us, and because God dwells amongst us, we have to have a higher morality level. There are oftentimes things that go down during war which are quite depraved, and the behavior that's totally unbefitting good people. And we've seen that before. But the Torah perspective is that the camp, God is with us, and therefore in a military camp, it actually has to have a higher moral standard, a highest of moral standards. And in fact, not only moral standards, but even hygiene has to be kept at a high level because God is with us. And certainly we wouldn't want to do anything to take that away. We want God involved with our lives. We want God, his blessings imbued upon everything that we're doing. So in that sense, the camp has to be holy. And in being holy, it has to have higher moral standards and higher hygiene standards than one might expect from other military levels. So keep the camp holy. The Torah also has guidelines on who should be enlisted. Just before going out to battle, the high priest would come out to the battlefront to the soldiers, and he would say, "Shema Yisrael, hear O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemies. Let your heart not be faint. You shall not be afraid. You shall not be alarmed. You shall not be terrified because of them." And the idea is that anyone who would become terrified, of course, that's bad for morale for the troops. And so the encouragement is that this is the beginning of like an invocation, an invocation to the troops. Be strong, be mighty, do not fear, because that can be very negative in a battle context here. But who shouldn't be there? The Kohen then goes out and he talks about who should not be present going into these wars. Someone who's newlywed, for example. A newlywed, their mind is on other things, and we want your mind focused on the battle. And so therefore newlyweds necessarily should not be enlisted, according to the Torah. And also, for example, the Torah talks about if someone's afraid. Now, afraid can be two things. Afraid of battle, get over it, that's part of war. But there's also can be afraid of sin, meaning that if someone's going into a battle and he's thinking, I don't deserve divine protection. If someone's going into battle thinking that they've sinned and they won't have divine protection, therefore they're extra afraid, and so their heart needs to be strong. So they need to either encourage themselves and know that God loves them no matter what, and God forgives 1,000 times and 1,000 times, and therefore go in with courage, but don't go in with fear. You shouldn't be there. King David fought valiantly in battle, and all of the wars that King David fought were divinely decreed wars, and it was conquering the land and helping to establish the land. But when it came time to build the temple which would be a temple of peace, God said that as much as David is sanctified for all of his efforts, he would not be allowed to build the house of peace. That would go to his son King Solomon. So David did everything he could to prepare for it, conquering the land and establishing the peace and bringing all the materials together. But God would not let him build his house of peace. Interesting insights. Yet another insight into the Jewish way of war. We talked before about when going into a war that the peace has to be given a chance. People have to be given the opportunity to surrender and to agree to live peacefully. But there's another insight that Maimonides talks about in the Jewish laws of war, which is that if you besiege a city, you only do so on three sides. You have to allow one other side for them to escape, to give up and to get out and to escape. And so the idea of not necessarily destroying everything, but allowing those who are ready to give up, allowing them to flee to safety. Now let's talk about the value of life. The Talmud Yerushalmi gives a story about an incident where a town was overrun and the enemy said, give us so-and-so, let's say Reuven. Give us Reuven or we'll wipe out the whole community. And the Talmud asks the question of, can you do that? Can you hand over someone to uncertain death or not? And the answer is no, you can't. We cannot be the arbiters of whose life is more valuable than another life. And in fact, the Lubavitcher Rebbe talks about every life, every single Jewish soul is a chelik elikai mimal mamash, an actual essence of God's infiniteness. And so is one piece of infinite more valuable than 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 pieces of infinite? So it's not up to us to make that decision. Commentaries do talk about the idea that if Reuven wants to volunteer himself and go out on his own, we can allow him to do so. But if we're forced to choose one over others, that is not something we can do. We all have to forfeit. That, of course, leads us to the idea that in the macrocosm, there's the concept of war in the world and good over evil. And the microcosm is the war that every individual has within ourselves, and that is the war of good over evil, of the spiritual over the physical. And ultimately, our job in this world is to create a dwelling place for God down here in the lowest world, meaning to create a spiritual within the physical. It's as if God made the universe physical out of spiritual, and our job is to make the physical into spiritual. And so ultimately, this is our war. The individual personal war is our war within ourselves of conquering our animal instincts and conquering our evil instincts and being able to bring out only the good. As is the way of Chassidus, we want to dig deeper and deeper and find the good things within. And I think this is the most important part. As we look back to the very beginning, we talked about Homos Mitzvah, the mitzvah that is commanded. And one of the commandments was to wage a war of vengeance for God against Midian. The Lord spoke to Moshe, saying, "Wage the vengeance of the Israelites against the Midianite." And so Moses spoke to the people, saying, "Carry out the vengeance of God against the Midianim." Rav Shalom Dovber of Lubavitch looked at the word Midian, and the conjugate of the word is Midan. Madan means a feud or a quarrel. So in direct inversion of the literal meaning, these passages could be read as a commandment to wage a genocidal war against quarrelsomeness, of argumentativeness, a campaign to erase the egotistical divisiveness that's rooted within us. So Moshe's term of a war, which is the vengeance of God, which really implies then that quarrelsomeness is not merely a social ill, but it's actually a sin against God. In other words, the real war we need to wage is the war against war itself. And may that lead to a time when the whole world will know peace.